Welcome to the Philly Prime Podcast. The big story in Philadelphia this week, obviously, is the primary election is now over for mayor. We have a winner on the Democratic side, Cherelle Parker. We have a winner on the Republican side, David O., both former city council people. Quite a night. The guy who was right on top of it the whole night, Tuesday night on primary night, was our FOX29 political analyst and my former colleague, Bruce Gordon. Bruce, welcome back to the show. We're going to talk about this, break it all down.
Always a pleasure, Dave. Good to be with you.
All right, Bruce, let's start with Cherelle Parker since she was the big story the other night. 2 weeks ago, this race was too close to call. They were neck and neck, a point apart, margin of error, add that all in, and all of a sudden, Cherelle Parker emerges from the six candidate field and wins by 10 to 11% with a pretty decent number, almost 78,000 votes. Your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I think it's fascinating in the sense that you're right. The polling, and there was limited polling, two relatively late independent polls, but they all showed, both of them, I should say, showed a very tight race, really bunched up around the 18, 19, 20% mark for several of the candidates, all of the women candidates of the five sort of top tier candidates, if you will. And that's what we thought we were going to get, was a very close match. Even on election night itself, the first batch of votes that came in, the first 55,000 votes or so that came in terms of what was counted first, were the mail-in ballots. And again, what's interesting here is this is not a Democrat versus Republican contest, obviously, where you'd say, all right, well, the mail-in ballots are going to be wildly different than the in-person votes because Democrats use mail-in and Republicans not so much. You might expect that the mail-in ballot numbers would reflect more or less what was going to go on all night, but not so. Mail-in ballots come in, and the Cherelle Parker camp is basically tied with Rebecca Reinhardt at about 27% each, and we kind of go down from there. But the very first in-person votes that came in, Cherelle Parker jumps up to 32, 33%. Rebecca Reinhardt falls back. And for the rest of the entire evening, the dynamics of the race never changed. The only difference at all for the entire evening, Helen Gim started out in second place, but distant second, or third place, I should say, distant third, and then kind of eased up a little bit. Microscopically improved her position, but no one really threatened Cherelle Parker for the rest of the evening, no matter where the votes were coming from. Each new successive dump of votes showed she's still in the lead by 11, 12 percentage points. And that was in the end what she got. She wound up with 32% of the vote to 23% for Reinhardt. So actually things tightened, again, microscopically, but a 9-point win is a significant victory.
Well, talk about Cherelle Parker. What did she do right here at the end, Bruce, or all throughout the campaign? I think she's very honest in the debates, especially the one on Fox 29. Straightforward. I think she spoke her mind, unafraid to do that, about crime, about stop and frisk, stuff like that. Was it people saw that candidate and said, this is the person I want? Because this is a field that was somewhat formidable. Rebecca Reinhardt, Helen Gim, a former city council person, Alan Dom, Jeffrey Brown, who had some key endorsements. Was it boots on the ground that won this for Cherelle Parker?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, after the fact, everybody has their theories. And of course, hindsight, as we all know, is 2020. I suspect that it might have been a combination of two things. A, that the polling did not adequately or accurately reflect the real support that Cherelle Parker had. But more important, you'll recall that both those late polls showed 15 to 20% undecided. It seems pretty clear that Cherelle Parker picked up the lion's share of those votes. Look, she did pretty much everything right. She had no major missteps in the campaign. You mentioned the Fox 29 debate. I thought she looked mayoral in that debate, in the sense that whatever you thought about individual policy positions and so forth, you looked at her on the stage and you said to yourself, I could see this person being mayor. And I wouldn't necessarily have said that about all of them, but Cherelle Parker looked the part and sounded the part. She's got an incredible backstory and a very difficult childhood in terms of her upbringing and so forth. Many hurdles to overcome. Spent time in the state legislature, then in city council. So she's got the experience both at the statewide level and local government. And she just put together a good campaign. It cannot be ignored also that she was the only candidate of color left among
where I
the
was going to
top
go
tier
next. Yeah.
candidates.
Mhm.
Yeah, she was the only candidate of color. Derek Green, the former city council person, had gotten out of the race. He's African American. Maria Quinones Sanchez, Latina candidate, had gotten out of the race as well.
Mhm.
So the other four candidates were white candidates. There's always a component of racial voting in the city, for better or for worse, and people
Mhm.
can debate that, till the cows come home. But
Yeah.
that cannot be ignored.
Yeah. She had a lot of union support. Did they get people to the polls? That 20% you're talking about? Is that what
Well,
happened here, you think?
Well, I think part of that's undoubtedly part of it. I talked on election night about the fact that Rebecca Reinhardt had some what sounded like important endorsements from former mayors, right?
Yeah.
You say to yourself, well, you can't get a much better endorsement than someone who's actually had the job and
Mhm.
says, hey, this person could do the job that I had. She had an endorsement from Michael Nutter. She had an endorsement from John Street. She made much of the fact that the two of them didn't really get along very often, but they
Mhm.
both agreed on one thing, that she was the best candidate.
Yeah.
Late in the game, she got an endorsement from Ed Rendell. The problem is that in the case of Nutter and Street, neither of those guys were wildly popular mayors
Yeah.
when they left office. In the case
Mhm.
of Rendell, he certainly was wildly popular. But
Yeah.
remember, he left the mayor's office 24 years ago.
Right.
Also, those are big names, but they don't necessarily come with a get out the vote apparatus.
Right.
Michael Nutter endorses you, but he doesn't have an army
Yeah.
of folks out there like, say, a union would to
Mhm.
get folks out to vote. And
Yeah.
Cherelle Parker had that. The building trades is a significant outfit.
Okay. How about the other positioning? Rebecca Reinhardt second and Helen Gim third. Kind of break that down for me a little bit. Did you expect it to be like that?
Well, again, the polling, such as it was, showed that they were top tier of the top tier candidates. They were
Reinhardt was actually in the
first.
lead, right?
Yeah, first and third, second and third, depending on which poll you looked at. And so it always looked like they were going to be close. There are some folks who believe that both of them sort of split up the progressive
Mhm.
vote in the city, and
Right.
that did neither one of them any big favor
Yeah.
on election night itself. Look, I think to a certain degree, there's probably something of a ceiling for the progressive candidates in the city. I made
Yeah.
the point on election night that the
Mhm.
most vocal and notable progressive in the city right now is Larry Krasner, the district attorney.
Yeah.
He certainly has his fans, but he certainly has plenty of detractors in the
Yeah.
city as well.
Including
And
most of these
so,
candidates. So,
right,
yeah.
right. Nobody was a huge Larry Krasner fan, and like it or not, when you say progressive, that's the name that comes to mind.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about crime being the number one issue, it probably does not help to
Mm.
have the progressive label on that particular issue.
Yeah. Yeah.
Helen Gim had the big rally on the Sunday before Election Day with Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez coming in from out of town. Maybe that revs up the base and gets the base out. I don't know
Yeah.
that it attracts anyone outside of that base.
Yeah.
And so it looks like she got her supporters to the poll, but nobody else, and she needed somebody else to get
Yeah.
there to get her the numbers she needed.
Yeah. Is she the biggest disappointment here, Helen Gim? I mean, I really thought she'd be neck and neck with whoever the top candidate was here. And is this a hit
Yeah.
for the progressive movement in Philadelphia? I mean, she got 52,000 votes. When she
Yeah.
runs at large, she gets like 120. So
Well,
people said 60,000 was kind of the winning number. It ended up being 77.8. So
right.
is she the disappointment in this group?
Well, I don't think that's necessarily unfair. With regard to the winning number, I mean, look, Cherelle Parker got about 78,000 votes.
Mhm.
Theoretically, depending on how those votes would have been split up, she
Right.
could have won this race with 60,000,
Yeah.
depending on how those 18,000 minus votes were spread around.
Right.
But look, Helen Gim, I think it was a disappointment. I think there
Yeah.
were a lot of folks who thought she was going to win this thing, or at least be much more competitive. As I say,
Mhm.
each new update of votes throughout election night was putting her closer to Rebecca Reinhardt in second place. She
Right.
never ultimately caught Reinhardt for second place.
Yeah.
Finished in third, again, 11 points behind Parker, and
Mhm.
frankly, never threatened. There was
Yeah.
never a time during the evening where a rational person could have said,
Yeah.
hey, with these updates, this could happen, that could happen. One of the things that happens on election night,
Right.
frankly, especially when you're talking about a Republican versus a Democrat, there are often pockets, say, statewide race in Pennsylvania. If the votes are coming in from a rural county in north
Mhm.
central Pennsylvania, the Republicans about to get bumped up in
Yeah.
the standings, so to speak, because those are going to be heavily Republican votes.
Yeah.
Conversely, if they're coming out of the city, that's going to be good news for the Democrat.
Mhm.
Each update election night none of them changed the dynamic of the race.
Yeah, that's what
Helen
surprised
Gim
me
never,
watching Tuesday night. I'm like, okay, I'm waiting for a jump from Gim. Okay, one of her districts didn't come in yet, or Rebecca Reinhardt, something where she thought she was going to have a lot of vote that didn't come in. Like you said, I kept waiting for that quick pop, and it never happened. Literally didn't happen the whole night.
Parker led from wire to wire right after
Mm-hmm.
the in-person votes started coming in,
Right.
literally from the very first in-person votes that were counted.
Yeah.
Alan Dom stayed at fourth place,
Yeah.
more or less where the polls had him. And Jeff Brown finished in fifth place, more or less where the polls had him in terms of number, percentage and so forth. So the only real issue was second and third, Reinhardt and Helen Gim throughout the evening. And I agree. I think the Helen Gim overall performance has to be somewhat of a disappointment for her supporters, needless to say, but just as an observer of the race.
And I thought Rebecca Reinhardt did pretty good here. She represented herself pretty well. She didn't get within, she got 9.8% behind, whatever. But she ran a pretty good race. She had some good TV ads, as you said, with the ex-mayors. She did some other ads I thought were good. Helen Gim supporters kind of blamed her results on last-minute attack ads from some out-of-town people, things like that. I'm not sure that carries water with me. I think there was just something about Cherelle Parker and that 20% undecided that, brought it home for her.
Yeah. Look, whoever loses, and I've been watching this kind of thing for 40 years now. No one ever loses because their message doesn't resonate with voters. It's never happened in the history of elections, even though it actually happens all the time. No one ever acknowledges that. It's, I didn't have the money I needed. The deck was stacked against me. It was a wave election for the other party. The attack ads were horribly unfair, but obviously effective. And that's why I didn't win. And so there's always a rationale / excuse for why you didn't do better. But at the end of the day, it just wasn't to be for Helen Gim. And it'd be interesting to see what's next for her. For example, obviously all these candidates who had elected office had to leave that office in order to run. It's a resign to run municipality. You have to quit your council job in order to run for mayor. So it'll be interesting to see what's next for Helen Gim.
Yeah, somebody
especially Dave, because of the way it works in Philadelphia, as we all know. If the Democrat who wins the election in November wants to get reelected, wants a second term, and pretty much they all do, it is more or less a foregone conclusion that they will get that second term. So the next open primary we'll have won't be for another 8 years. A lot can happen between now and 8 years from now.
Yeah, I saw something floating around about her possibly challenging Dwight Evans. I don't see that. He's pretty strong. We'll see kind of where that goes. So this shapes up now with David O winning the Republican nomination. I think there were 240,000 votes cast in the Democratic primary. I don't know how many David O got. It was 10 something when I last looked, but he's the candidate obviously now to go against Cherelle Parker.
Yeah, look, I mean, one of the things that I think is kind of interesting is that when you look at turnout, the turnout numbers I think are a little misleading. And I was crunching some numbers just this morning, in fact. The overall turnout is reported as something like 26%, right?
Okay.
Or thereabouts. The problem is there's about 1 million plus registered voters in the city of Philadelphia. Well over 100,000 are unaffiliated, meaning they would not have been able to participate in either of these party primaries. They are closed primaries. In the Republican primary, there's 100 and some odd thousand registered Republicans in the city of Philadelphia. In that primary, of course, for mayor, there was no real contest. David O was the only candidate on the ballot. Republicans for a number of years now, frankly, have had trouble coming up with one real Republican, that is to say, a person who's been a Republican for a while, not just a disaffected Democrat whom they recruited. So to try and get two candidates to run against each other for a meaningful primary was never going to happen. And so the number there doesn't mean much either. If you just look at the number of Democrats who voted versus registered Democrats, the total turnout's around 31%. Still embarrassingly low, but not quite as low as what some folks would have you believe.
Yeah. You mentioned on Good Day Philadelphia yesterday, you were talking a little bit about, can David O win? And your answer was pretty short. It was no. And you talked about the last time we had a hotly contested Democrat versus Republican. That's Sam Katz back in the day. That is the last tight race we've had with Democrats and Republicans. It's been all downhill since.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because when you think back, you think of sort of the legendary Ed Rendell in terms of his, popularity in the city. Interestingly, his two races, in 1991 and 1995. In 91, he wins 64% to 30%.
Right.
In 95, for re-election, he wins 77 to 21. Big lopsided victories.
Yeah.
But then we follow that in 1999 with John Street over Sam Katz. That race it's hard to remember because it was so far ago, and things have changed so much. That race was 50 to 49, 50% to 49%. John Street over Sam Katz. When it came time for re-election, Street made a big jump in the margin there, 58-41. And ever since then, the last 4 races, the Democrat has gotten anywhere from 75 to 85% of the vote. They've been complete and utter blowouts. And that does 2 things. First of all, it keeps the Democrats in power, and you may think that's a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your political persuasion. But one of the things it does is it makes it very hard for Republicans to try and recruit strong candidates. You basically say to them, hey, would you like to get your brains beaten in for the next 6 months? You're going to have a fraction the money, a fraction the support. And on election night, they're going to call the race for your opponent at 8:01 p.m. The doors of the polling place will barely have closed, and they're going to call it for your opponent. Would you like to sign up for that? No, thanks. So I give David O a lot of credit. He's a legitimate candidate.
Formidable candidate, possibly, I think.
Yeah. Absolutely a legitimate candidate with a legitimate legislative record. He's been an at-large councilman for a number of years now. And again, you have to give him credit for being willing to do what you have to do, again, which is to resign from your position in council in order to run for mayor. He knows it's a tremendous uphill battle. I would expect from David O, and I know him a little bit, I've interviewed him on countless occasions. I would expect that he's a guy who's going to be above board, and it's going to be a clean race and a race about ideas. He's not somebody who's going to, get into the mud and be slinging mud and so forth. So I expect a legitimate race. And look, if he can make it at least reasonably competitive, and by reasonably competitive in this day and age, you're talking about 70-30, losing 70-30, at least perhaps then you convince candidates going forward that, there's a glimmer of light on the horizon, and that they're not going to get so slaughtered on election night that what's the point? So I give David O some credit, and I think he could make things at least halfway interesting.
Do you see Cherelle Parker even engaging David O here? Do you see the potential for debates? Do you see the potential for forums, things like that? Given it's 7-1 Democrats in the city, and it's almost a fait accompli here for Cherelle Parker, do you see her wanting to and engaging with David O in some kind of format like that? I mean, I'm sure Fox 29 is going to try and put together.
Boy, I wish. Sure. Look, I wish that I could say yes. I think she'll say yes to all kinds of debates and forums and so forth. Look, she would not be any different from any other prohibitive favorite in an election campaign to say, what is in it for me for participating in debates when if I just keep my nose to the grindstone, do my campaign, duties and avoid my competitor, my challenger, I'll win the race. So it's not in her best interest from a purely political strategy standpoint to want to engage in a bunch of debates. Certainly David O, like any challenger who knows he's well behind, is going to want 15 different debates. He may get 1 or 2, but in a perfect world, there would be X number of debates no matter what the scenario was. But we all know that the person who leads big wants fewer debates. The person who trails wants more debates. They've got to do something to change the dynamic.
All right, clear off the table here. Primary's over. People in Philadelphia still talking about crime. You made a good point the other day on the show that homicides are down 12%, shootings are down 10 to 15%. The numbers are going down too radically high still in the city. We're in the still 490, 500 plus murder range, which is not good. Not good. People, I mean, Cherelle Parker is going to have to deliver on something if she's the mayor. She has a bit of a good plan. She wants 300 more new cops on the street. Great. She wants street lights repaired, graffiti taken down. She wants programs, good programs, community programs for kids, some that are accountable, those kind of programs. If you're going to hand out millions of dollars, you better be doing what you say you're doing with that money. I'm not saying they're not, but she's going to want accountability for that. How strong does she come at this now, coming right out of the gate? She take a week off here, 2 weeks off, let Memorial Day pass, and then get into it, I'm sure. But she's got to carry that torch pretty strongly.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see. Look, the traditional thing is that the primary happens in May, and for most of the summer, it's almost a sort of a joke in this area. Most of the summer, folks head to the shore, and they're not paying much attention when they're at the shore. Their TV's not tuned in to debates and other things like that. They're on the beach. And so nothing really gets underway until kind of Labor Day or so, and then things kind of kick into high gear. Obviously, in the case of David O, he's got to utilize that whole summer to see if he can make some hay, make some ground up. And look, she's got some policies, she's got some programs that she's interested in implementing. All of them have their challenges. When you talk about, for example, putting more police on the street, I think most people would agree that's a good idea. Where do you come up with the money, and where do you come up with the people who want to join the police force? It is not an easy job, as you well know, and it is not a job that pays particularly well in the city of Philadelphia compared to some of the surrounding suburbs, and compared to what you have to put up with on that job. And so it's one thing to say we need more cops on the beat. It's quite another to be able to actually get them into the training classes and get them out on the street. Her position on stop and frisk, I think, is fascinating, and it's worth looking at, because she basically says, I think we can do stop and frisk in a legitimate, legal, constitutionally sound way, and not have it turn into just stopping the African-American kid who's walking down the street because he's African-American, and we come up with some, ginned up excuse for why we needed to stop him. There was too much of that going on. The courts have seen that all over the country, including in Philadelphia. And so she took some heat for her support of stop and frisk, but she insists that it can be done properly and safely and effectively. And she believes that's part, not the entire solution, obviously, but part of the equation for getting these crime numbers under control. We'll see.
And the bottom line is Philadelphia police are still doing stop and frisk, the Terry stop, it's called. They are monitored by the Justice Department. They are monitored by different organizations here in Philadelphia on the way they do those stops. But I don't think from the street level up to the old third floor at the Roundhouse, they felt a lot of support for those stops. Now you have a mayor coming in who says she supports it if it's done constitutionally. You can't just go in people's pockets looking for a gun. You have to have reasonable suspicion. You have to be within the parameters set out by the courts that you just mentioned, and set out by the department and monitored by these other groups. If you do it that way, and police officers that I talk to feel like they have support from the commissioner's office and the mayor's office to do that, to prevent crime and to prevent shootings and the things that are going on in the city, if they feel that support, I think you could see that improve things. Now they don't feel that support. They feel like they're going to be prosecuted for a stop that doesn't go exactly the way the book says it ought to go. And listen, mistakes get made. Nothing is perfect in any world, including journalism. So that's all I'm saying here. I think if it's done constitutionally and they know the mayor has them backed up and the next police commissioner backs them up, I think you might see some improvement there.
Yeah, look, it's a dicey scenario. It's easy for someone sitting out in the suburbs to make these comments. But look, some of the folks in these difficult to police neighborhoods, these crime-ridden neighborhoods where folks are literally afraid to go out their front door. And you and I've spent many, many, many days and nights in some of the tougher neighborhoods in the city of Philadelphia doing the reporting that I did, and certainly in your job as a police reporter. There's nothing more disheartening than seeing these wrought iron, what amount to cages on people's front porches because they are so afraid of someone breaking into their home. And you talk to some of the older residents and they are literally afraid to go out and take a walk in the daylight, much less in the evening. And so it's one thing to say, well, we need to make sure that things are being done by the book. That's wonderful. And that's absolutely the case. And that should be done by the book. But there are people in these neighborhoods who are saying, wait a minute, yes, it should be done by the book, but we need a police presence here. Because what's happening right now is not working. I can't walk out my front door and feel safe. So there's no one answer. And I think, at least for the moment, Cherelle Parker seems to have threaded that needle between we got to do policing right, but we got to do policing.
Yeah, and we got to do it better. I mean, response times have to improve. She wants 300 new cops. That's not easy to do. We talked about this with Jeff Cole 2 weeks ago. It's a 9-month program. You got to pick the candidates. I think they had 300 or 400 show up for a recent job fair, and like 92 of them actually qualified. You can usually do 100 to 125, maybe 150 at a time, but that's still 9 months before they hit the ground. In the meantime, people are still out sick. They're out on disability. They're retiring. They're in the drop. They're leaving the police department for their own personal reasons, things like that. So the numbers continue to go down before they can go up. This is going to take, as you said before, an infusion of cash to make that happen and some patience to see that. In the meantime, I think you got to go through the department here. Whoever the new commissioner is picked by Cherelle Parker, we'll get to that in a minute, and look at the department and see where you can take bodies and put those bodies on the street to do police work till you can fill those ranks.
Yeah, I think there's no question that when you look and look, everybody has a reason why they have the management structure that they have.
Right.
But sometimes I think it takes a fresh set of eyes to say, all right, do we really need this many managers? And do we really need more players? To use a baseball analogy, we don't need a manager, a first base coach, a third base coach, a pitching coach, a hitting coach, a base running coach, and 15 other coaches. We need more players. And in the case of the police department, I think there's any number of ways of looking at this. And one of the ways is to say, as you just alluded to, there are too many guys with the white shirts who are kind of running things, and too few guys with the blue shirts actually out on the streets patrolling. Because look, I'm in the city, not nearly as much as I used to be, but I'm in the city frequently enough. And when I'm out in the city, walking the streets, say in Center City, for example, I just don't see a police presence. I just don't see police officers out there to where if something happened that was bad, some violent crime occurred, I could feel comfortable that, well, all right, they're one block over and they should be able to get here and help people out. I just don't see it. And I think a lot of people feel like they don't see it.
Yeah. And I mean, I reported this a while back. There were some evenings 5 or 6 months ago where in some districts there were only 2 or 3 patrol cars on the street for the entire district at night. And that's not only dangerous for the public, that's dangerous for the police officers who have to respond to the scene of the crime. So that can't happen. I think what you're saying is right on the money. There's got to be probably less white shirts, more blue shirts on the street to go out and patrol these areas, police the corners that you're talking about, make people in Center City who are going out to dinner, the theater, visiting friends, after work party or whatever, feel safe. And until they do, this is a tough thing for Cherelle Parker. If she is the next mayor, you have to stay on point with that, and you have to pick somebody to run the police department. She was non-committal on Danielle Outlaw as far as her staying. I can see her going with her own person here. There's some names out there. We talked about it last time, potentially Kevin Bethel, former deputy commissioner. He's now head of the school police. I think you have to look at Joel Dales, who's a deputy commissioner now, John Stanford, who's up on the administrative floor up there. Those kind of people, they're going to get looked at. She may have somebody in mind right off the bat of her own picking. She may, instead of going with someone who's either been there or is currently there, she may decide, I want to go somewhere new. Any thoughts on that from her yet? Or it's really,
I guess
she wasn't very specific about what she wanted there.
No, and that's probably the smart thing to do.
Yes.
I think giving too much away in terms of personnel moves in particular is probably not wise. I guess I would answer your question with a question to you because you're the real expert here. Obviously, in the case of Richard Ross ascending to the commissioner's role, you had someone who was within the department. But most of the names that we've talked about over the last number of years, especially those who I think broadly speaking are viewed as having been successes, I'm thinking of the Charles Ramseys and the John Timothy's and so forth, came from outside the department. Is it your sense that it makes more sense to go outside the department and get some fresh eyeballs on this? Obviously, Danielle Outlaw was a fresh set of eyeballs. She's got plenty of critics and plenty of detractors and so forth. So it's no guarantee that it's going to work out well. But is it your sense that maybe fresh eyeballs are what's needed in this department?
Well, listen, I think when you have people with the resume that Kevin Bethel has, some of these other candidates that are in town, you make an effort to go talk to them, get their ideas. What would be your plan if I picked you? That kind of thing. And then maybe you throw the net out a little wider. I think the Danielle Outlaw experiment failed. Wonderful person, very personable, pretty good with the media when she spoke to the media, that kind of thing. But the numbers have been awful. Not all her fault, but we know crime runs in 3-year cycles. Homicides go up, shootings go up, things like that. Those are uncontrollable things sometimes, that kind of deal. But you have to be forceful. I don't think that occurred here. So I don't know if going outside is a good idea. The other thing is, who's out there in another city who would be strong enough to kind of come in and do that? Would Cherelle Parker feel more comfortable having somebody she knows, a face she knows, somebody she can call to the mayor's office and say, what is going on here? Why aren't we doing this? What are we going to do? Somebody accountable. I think if she's comfortable with somebody in the city, she'll pick somebody in the city. If she's not, I could see her casting the net out wider and then going for some, I don't want to say superstar, but somebody with a proven record in a big city that can handle the situation like you can in the fourth biggest city, Philadelphia, because this is not a job for somebody from the 25th largest city in the country. It's just not. You have to be somebody, either a commissioner, former commissioner, deputy commissioner in some of these big cities, to come in here and grasp 6,500 police officers and a plan to go out there and knock down these numbers on the shootings, carjackings, home invasions, all that kind of stuff. That stuff's got to stop. And you need somebody with a point-specific plan that Cherelle will agree with, and stand next to, and make that happen.
Well, and it's a great point. And I think the other aspect of this is that perception, it's an old cliche, but it's largely true. Perception can become reality. And when you had someone, for example, like a Charles Ramsey, there was the perception that he was in charge, in control, had some real answers. He didn't claim to have all the answers, but you did have a sense that he had things kind of under control. As you say, some of this is beyond their control. The reality is that these murder numbers that have gone skyrocket high during the pandemic, and now without any, as far as I'm aware, any brand new programs over the last 2 years, those numbers are now coming down in a reasonably significant fashion. Again, way too high, but still coming down. How much of that was actually Danielle's fault when they went up? How much is it to her credit now that they're coming down somewhat? Who knows? But there's a perception out there. I think it's very clear to say there's a perception out there that the department is, if not rudderless, does not have as much control and as much of a path to be charted as you would like to have.
And you look at Chuck Ramsey, you mentioned him. Listen, he went through one of the most difficult time periods in this city. 8 police officers were murdered on his watch in 2.5 years. It was an incredible time in Philadelphia. And you have to be super strong to not only keep crime under control in this city, but then when something like that happens, to keep the men and women of the police department on board, out there doing their job when their brothers and sisters are being murdered out on the street. And 8 officers in 2.5 years. I've never seen an onslaught like that in my 36 years in Philadelphia, covering the city of Philadelphia, both at Channel 10 and here at Fox 29. So you need somebody strong like that. That's my point here. A true leader that Cherelle Parker feels comfortable standing next to, kind of sharing the burden to go forward. That's my feeling.
And look, the mayor will get great credit. I mean, this was Ramsey was a Michael Nutter hire, right? And one of the things you can praise Michael Nutter and criticize him depending on what issue you're talking about. And of course, just like Jim Kenney got hit out of the blue with a global pandemic, Michael Nutter was dealing with the aftermath of the global recession that changed his budget and shattered his budget almost overnight. So you can criticize Michael Nutter for a variety of things, and I certainly have, but you got to give credit where it's due. And that hire of Charles Ramsey was certainly a positive. And it, frankly, if it's done right, it can take one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest single issue on the mayor's plate, and at least, cut that portion that's on your plate in half and say, okay, I'm confident that the person I hired as my police commissioner has a handle on what's going on, so that I can deal obviously with the crime issue, but I can deal with 57 other issues because I know I've got a real partner in fighting crime, and I can be confident that they know what they're doing, and that not only the reality, but the perception is there that things are under control.
Yeah, I think that's why this is such an important choice right off the bat. For everybody's talking about a state of emergency, day one, things like that during the primary campaign, things like that. But I really
Almost
do
certainly
think,
the most important hire they'll
yes,
make, right? I mean, I
yep,
don't know that there's any more important hire. You could argue that the
yep,
managing director is a hugely important position, and certainly
yep,
it is. But
yep,
police commissioner may well be the most important decision you make.
yeah. Let's talk about one other controversial thing that Cherelle Parker's been talking about the whole campaign, and that's a longer school day and uh, school throughout the entire year. Those things cost a lot of money, and they might be difficult for people to swallow in terms of extending the school day till 6 o'clock, I believe it is she wants, and or going year round. That might be tough to sell.
Yeah, look, it's funny because in various countries around the world, they already have the longer school day
Yep.
and longer school year. The U.S., the last time I looked at any kind of numbers, the U.S. is toward the bottom of the list
Mhm.
in terms of length of school day, length of school year, and so forth. And you could argue that the results speak for themselves. That the U.S. is hardly at the top of the list in terms of student achievement. And so there's some real value there. But this is one of those situations where it's not just a question of the money that it would take. You've got to get buy-in for something like this from
Yeah.
the school teachers
Right.
themselves, the teachers union. Good luck telling these teachers that they're going to be working a longer school day and a longer school year,
Right.
given the fact that it's rather unlikely that you're going to be able to bump their pay up by 10 or 15 or 20%
Yeah.
commensurate with the added hours that would be needed to do something like
Right.
that. So, as with almost all of the big issues, it's wonderful to have a plan, but how do you pay for it? One of the things I think during the campaign
Hmm.
that probably got Helen Gim in a little bit of a jam, she made much of the fact that she had bold plans, bold visions for the city. Everyone else was a little too faint of heart. She was quick to
Hmm.
criticize some of the other candidates. But the pushback, the blowback was, you've got these wonderful plans. How do you pay for them?
Yeah.
There's not a big, pickup truck or dump truck or aircraft carrier full
Yeah.
of cash waiting to pay for these programs that you'd like to institute.
Yeah.
So that's the dollar sign is there on every single issue. The one area I do think that Cherelle Parker may have a slight leg up, and
Hmm.
it's probably slight. Her time as a state lawmaker would presumably give her some relationships that may improve at least slightly the relationship between Philadelphia and
Right.
Harrisburg. I mentioned
Hmm.
Helen Gim. The reality is that often when Helen Gim was in Harrisburg, it was with a bullhorn in her hand,
Yeah. At a protest.
yelling at the legislature because they weren't doing this, that, or the other thing with the city.
Hmm.
Might have been a legitimate point,
Yeah.
but it doesn't make you a lot of friends in Harrisburg.
Yeah.
Obviously, Parker is going to come into office, remember, with a Democrat in the governor's office. Now, after this election, the special election on election night, a razor thin, but still a majority in the House.
Hmm.
The Republicans control the Senate, but at least there is some hope for being able to kind of get at least a little bit of
Yeah.
what the city wants out of Harrisburg with Cherelle Parker and that background in
Yeah.
state government.
All right. We talked about the summer recess here. Would you or would you not think it's a good idea for Cherelle Parker, given the 7-1 Democratic majority in terms of voters in the city? Would it not be in her best interest to use the summer to fortify that extended school day plan and that go to school longer plan with some kind of financial component that she might be able to work? And would it not be a good use of her summer to hit the ground running in terms of searching for a police commissioner? Get that all ready, up and running. So if you do win in November, and most likely she will, you can step right to the front right off the bat with a good idea or two.
Yeah, look, if she's as smart as I think she is, and I'm
Mhm.
sure she's doing this already, they've already got the transition plan
Yeah.
underway. It's, in certain circumstances, you might think that's a little bit, hubristic, a little bit presumptuous to
Right.
say, well, we're automatically going to win, so let's get the planning underway. Look, in the city of Philadelphia, the numbers are what they are. This is not a political comment I'm making here. This is
Mhm.
math. 7-1 and history. It's been years since there's even been a competitive race. So she knows that she's got a huge chance of winning. And it makes sense for her to start using the summer because there's not going to be a ton of public events. Again, folks just aren't paying attention. She's got a couple of months now, at least, to be able to really put the pen to pencil or pen to paper, I should say, and start figuring out the specifics here, because it's one thing to make general claims and promises in a 30-second campaign ad. It's quite another once you're actually in office and the rubber hits the road, so to speak. So if she's as smart as I think she is, all of this stuff will be on the agenda for her summer.
Your thoughts? Could you see Rebecca Reinhardt potentially in her administration in some position that would assist Cherelle Parker going forward? Could you see Maria Quinones Sanchez in a position? I've heard some people talk about her maybe managing director to attack the drug problem in Kensington with Cherelle Parker. Cherelle did talk about addressing that situation. Sanchez talked about that throughout her short-lived campaign, that kind of thing. Rebecca Reinhardt did a pretty good job as controller, digging into the budget, finding spots to get money out of, seeing where things went wrong. Could they potentially be people that, while kept at an arm's length distance in a position within the government, could do Cherelle Parker well?
I would say this simply, and I don't claim to have any inside knowledge about Cherelle Parker's personnel decisions. My sense during the primary campaign was that there was not a whole lot of nastiness in general, and in specific, there wasn't a whole lot of nastiness aimed at Cherelle Parker. So you don't at least start out with the premise that, would you consider having Fred here, who finished third in the voting on primary night, in your administration? Well, no, because Fred spent the last 3 weeks of the campaign bashing me over the head with every campaign ad he could come up with. I don't think there was a lot of that went on. It was not my sense that there was a lot of Cherelle Parker bashing by any of the other candidates. So to the degree that she thinks there's a specific area of expertise, and obviously the most obvious example would be Rebecca Reinhardt, given her time as controller and crunching the numbers and so forth. It might not be a bad idea. It's certainly worth considering. I don't know what kind of specific relationship they had. Obviously, in some cases, you had folks who were fellow city council members, and so that might have been a little different kind of relationship. Interestingly, speaking of the math and the history here, either way, whoever wins, whether it's Parker or O, this will now be the fourth consecutive Philadelphia mayor who comes right from as you mentioned, the third floor of the police headquarters. In politics terms, the fourth floor of City Hall is where City Council does its business. The second floor is where the mayor has their office. And so this is going to be the fourth consecutive administration where someone goes from the fourth floor to the second floor. And as we move forward, it's pretty clear that this is the route to go from council to the mayor's office. Interestingly, well, it's interesting, Dave, because in national politics, of course, when you're a legislator, and not an executive, but a legislator, you are a congressman or a United States senator, it can be challenging because in a hyper-competitive, hyper-partisan world, you've made hundreds and hundreds of votes that almost always aggravated half the population. If you're a Democrat running and you had all these votes, a significant number of those votes angered Republicans, and now you've got to kind of make amends to get the votes you need. These city council members, what's interesting, of course, is that Democrats have such thorough and complete control of council that the vast majority of votes are overwhelming votes. There's 17 members of city council, not at all unusual for votes to be 17-0, 15-2. Maybe a couple of Republicans are against something that they're doing. But the bottom line is you do have a legislative record as a council person, lots and lots of votes, but very few of them would likely be viewed as controversial, such that they annoyed or angered a bunch of folks in the city, and they can be used against you then in an attack ad. I don't know of any ads that I recall during this campaign where someone was bashed for their city council votes in any meaningful way.
And David O is a councilman as well, so council people don't usually go back and forth with each other. Do you see any big issue emerging this fall between the two of them? We didn't see it at all during the primary. There were no home run balls hit, a single or a double hit in the gap maybe once or twice here, but no long ball shot that could kind of change the course of the election here. I don't see that here unless something dramatic happens in the next 3 or 4 months. It looks like it's going to be
Yeah, look,
straight up what we're calling it today.
Yeah, look, there's always the possibility that some sort of personal scandal erupts on one side or the other, and that can change the dynamic. That's just the way things work.
Right.
But other than that, look, the fact is that if it weren't for the math, that daunting math, that 7-to-1 margin of Democrats over Republicans in terms of registered voters,
Yeah.
David O has a compelling case to make. And that case is that Democrats have been in charge of the city of Philadelphia for decades now.
Right.
And they have been in complete control, not just the mayor's office, but city council, super majorities in city council. And there are lots of things that are wrong with the city of Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Crime, as we've talked about at some length. Housing, affordable housing is a problem. Issues for the opioid addiction crisis and mental health and how those two issues are intertwined. Schools, the education system in the city, trash. The city is, to put it bluntly, filthy.
Yeah.
And has been filthy for years. So there is lots to complain about if you're David O, if you do it effectively and you do it in a smart way to say, look, I know I'm a Republican and you folks are all Democrats, but what has that gotten you over the last 10, 20, 30 years? I would argue if I'm David O, hasn't gotten you much.
Yeah.
So, again, if he's effective with his messaging, there's a message to be had there. It's not like things are going so well that you say, all right, geez, how do I complain about this? Everything's going beautifully in the city. I got to find something or make something up to criticize or complain about. David O's got plenty of material there to work with.
Yeah, it'd be a good way to come out of the box right off the bat after Labor Day, and or maybe start early if you can. Bruce, listen, fantastic job the other night. Thanks for coming on the program several times this
My
spring
pleasure.
to talk about it. I'll give you the summer off for a little bit here, unless something major comes up, and we'll see you again in the fall to talk about the race. Hopefully, both parties engage here. We see a good spirited debate. I'd like to see a good debate on Fox 29, similar to the one they had early this year, that kind of thing. But I always appreciate you coming on the show, Bruce, sharing your political wisdom with us. And you've been busy boy this week, all day Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, and now with me this afternoon. I appreciate you doing that. Thanks for coming on the show.
It's always my pleasure, Dave. As I always say to folks, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, no matter who's in control, a two-party system, a thriving two-party system is almost always best for everybody involved. And so I would love to see a real spirited matchup come the fall with a real exchange of ideas and not just a sort of going through the motions thing where one side knows they're going to win, the other side knows they're going to lose, but a real exchange of ideas. It can only help the city. And I think whether you live in the city or you live in the suburbs and frequent the city for work or for play, you want the best for the city of Philadelphia. And that happens when there's a real exchange of ideas.
Yeah, I think we can all agree with that. People want to see things get better. I think, and no matter where you live, even down at the shore where I live, I want to be able to go to Philadelphia and have dinner. I want to be able to go visit friends. I want to stop in at Fox 29 and say hello to my old colleagues, things like that. And I want to be able to know, and do it safely, And I think that's what most people want. Hopefully that's what we'll get. We'll have a good exchange of ideas, and we get to see you again talking all about it. So I appreciate that, Bruce. Thank you again for coming on the show. And that's Philly Prime for this week, folks. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.